The world had been reduced to a ribbon of mud and stone, a wound stitched across the gray, weeping skin of the Scheldt Estuary. It was called the Sloe Channel Causeway, a name that held no poetry, only the hard, grinding reality of its purpose, to connect the island of Walcheren to the South Beveland peninsula. To the men of C Troop 15th Reconnaissance Regiment, it was simply the end of the earth. They were an appendage of the larger beast, the venerable 51st Highland Division, a unit steeped in a history that felt impossibly distant in the cold, sucking mud of October 1944. Their task, as outlined by a fresh-faced lieutenant named Shaw who held his map case like a holy text, was simple reconnaissance. A push across the causeway, a quick probe of the German defenses, and a return before the tide turned the surrounding polders into an impassable moat. It was a milk run, Shaw had said, his voice betraying a confidence born of classrooms, not craters. Sergeant MacLeod, a man whose face was a roadmap of older, harsher campaigns from North Africa to Normandy, knew better. He tasted the air and felt the familiar, acidic clench in his gut. This was not the air of a milk run. It was heavy, laden with the smell of brine, cordite, and something else, the patient, watchful silence of an enemy that had already chosen its killing ground. His Humber armored car, its engine a low, guttural growl, felt less like a weapon of war and more like a steel coffin waiting for a nail. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil, sweat, and the faint, nervous tang of young men trying not to show their fear. Trooper Evans, barely 19 and still carrying the soft, pastoral roundness of a Welsh farm boy in his cheeks, fiddled with the breech of the Besa machine gun, the metallic clicks a nervous tick in the suffocating quiet. He was the gunner, but MacLeod saw him as the troop's canary, the one whose silence or song would signal the purity or poison of the air ahead. The grand strategy, the one discussed in command posts far from the reach of the Scheldt's damp chill, was called Operation Vitality. It was part of the larger, grinding battle to clear the Scheldt Estuary and open the port of Antwerp to Allied shipping. Without Antwerp, the supply lines for the push into Germany were strangulated, and the entire Allied advance was beginning to shudder and stall. Men like General Guy Simons, commanding the 1st Canadian Army to which the 51st Highland Division was attached, saw the causeway on a map, a simple line, a problem of logistics and engineering. But for the men of the 51st Highland Division, and especially the reconnaissance troops now inching towards it, the Sloe Channel Causeway was a theological proposition. It was a test of faith in machines, in orders, in the very concept of a plan surviving contact with a place like this. MacLeod gave the signal a short, sharp chop of his hand. The Humber armored car lurched forward, its tires finding purchase on the slick, stone-chipped surface of the causeway's approach. The road itself was elevated, a spine of dark rock and gravel rising just a few feet above the glistening, treacherous mudflats that stretched to a horizon of gray water and grayer sky. On either side, the polder landscape was a geometric nightmare of ditches and dikes, currently drained by the low tide but waiting, always waiting, to be reclaimed by the North Sea. The causeway ran straight for nearly a mile, a perfect enfilade. To advance along it was to offer oneself up for judgment. MacLeod felt the eyes on them, unseen but palpable. The German defenders on Walcheren Island were not fools. They had had 4 years to turn this natural choke point into a fortress. Ahead of them, 2 more Humber cars from C Troop 15th Reconnaissance Regiment formed the tip of the spear. Lieutenant Shaw was in the lead vehicle, no doubt still clinging to the belief that speed and aggression would see them through. MacLeod, commanding the 3rd car, held back slightly, his natural caution a brake against the lieutenant's youthful impetuousness. Inside their steel shell, the world was a series of vibrations and muffled sounds. Evans scanned the Walcheren end of the causeway through the narrow slit of his gun sight, his knuckles white on the grips of the Besa. The weapon felt solid, reassuring, a piece of irrefutable logic in a world that was about to become insane. "See anything, Evans?" MacLeod's voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the engine. "Nothing, Sergeant. Just the end of the road. Looks like a roadblock. Some kind of concrete barrier." MacLeod had seen the reconnaissance photos. The Germans had cratered the railway line that ran parallel to the road, and erected a series of concrete anti-tank obstacles. They had sown the shoulders of the causeway with mines. And somewhere, nestled in concrete bunkers and reinforced earthworks on the Walcheren shore, they would have their guns trained on every inch of this godforsaken path. Likely 88mm guns, the versatile terror of the German arsenal, perfectly suited for this kind of flat-trajectory, long-range killing. It was a textbook defensive position, and the men of the 51st Highland Division, were about to drive straight into its teeth as part of the grand Operation Vitality. The lead Humber reached the halfway point. Nothing. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of their own engines and the lonely cry of a gull. It was a predatory silence. MacLeod could feel the tension coiling in his own muscles, a wire drawn tighter and tighter with every yard they covered. He glanced at his driver, a quiet Glaswegian named Creef, whose focus was entirely on keeping the heavy vehicle centered on the narrow road. Fear was a private thing in these cramped spaces. It had no room to expand, so it compressed inwards, turning into a hard, dense knot in the pit of the stomach. Then the world tore itself apart. It did not begin with a single shot, but with a symphony of destruction. A flat, vicious crack echoed from the Walcheren shore, and a fountain of earth and stone erupted just in front of Lieutenant Shaw's lead vehicle, an 88mm gun. Before the sound had even fully registered, a second and third gun opened up. Geysers of water and mud shot into the air on either side of the causeway, the shells screaming in with a noise like ripping canvas. Simultaneously, from hidden positions along the railway embankment, the distinctive, frantic hammering of MG-42 machine guns began, their tracer rounds stitching bright green lines through the gloom. Shaw's Humber swerved violently, trying to evade the inevitable. But there was nowhere to go. A shell struck the second car in the column, a direct hit on its engine block. The vehicle exploded in a greasy orange and black fireball, the force of the blast lifting it from the road and tossing it onto its side. The wreckage immediately became a burning barricade, blocking any chance of retreat. MacLeod watched, his mind a cold, clear instrument of observation even as his heart hammered against his ribs. They were trapped. The milk run was over. Cries, halt, reverse, get us into cover behind the wreck. MacLeod's voice was a roar, cutting through the sudden pandemonium inside the car. But it was too late. Another 88mm shell, fired with brutal precision, struck their own Humber. The impact was not an explosion but a colossal, deafening blow, as if they had been struck by a giant's hammer. The armored car shuddered, and the air was filled with the shriek of tortured metal and the smell of ozone. The shell had struck the turret ring, jamming it solid. A spray of hot, razor-sharp metal fragments, spalled from the interior of their own armor, ricocheted around the compartment. Evans screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony, clutching at his face. Creef was slumped over the wheel, unnaturally still. Evans, are you hit? MacLeod scrambled over to the gunner, ignoring the storm of machine gun fire that was now lashing their vehicle. The bullets sparked and ricocheted off the Humber's steel hide, a furious metallic rain. Evans pulled his hands away from his face. Blood poured from a dozen small cuts, and a larger gash wept crimson above his right eye. But his eyes, wide with shock and pain, were clear. I think so, Sergeant. My face. I can see, though. I can still see. MacLeod dragged Creef's body from the driver's seat. There was a neat, dark hole in the back of his helmet. Death had been instantaneous. MacLeod took his place, trying to get the engine to respond. Coughed, sputtered, and died. The shell had done its work. They were immobilized, a stationary steel target in the middle of the Sloe Channel Causeway. Lieutenant Shaw's lead vehicle, miraculously untouched, had managed to push past the first burning wreck and was now trying to reverse, its machine gun firing defiantly back at the German positions. But it was a futile gesture. A well-aimed mortar round landed directly on its rear deck, and it too went silent. In less than 2 minutes, C Troop 15th Reconnaissance Regiment had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The survivors, MacLeod, a wounded Evans, and perhaps a handful of men from the other crews, were pinned down in their wrecked vehicles, isolated in the center of a perfectly prepared killing ground. The tide had begun to turn. Slowly, inexorably, the gray waters of the Scheldt Estuary began to creep back over the mudflats, filling the ditches and polders, turning the narrow causeway into an island. MacLeod looked out through the driver's slit. The burning Humber cast a flickering, hellish light on the scene. The German guns had fallen silent for a moment, as if contemplating their handiwork. He knew what they were doing. They were waiting for the tide to complete their work, to cut them off completely from the rest of the 51st Highland Division, from the entire 1st Canadian Army, from the whole world. He checked his watch. It was 16:30 on October 31st, 1944. They were forgotten men on a ribbon of stone, and their 48 hours had just begun. Night fell not as a blanket but as a shroud. The cold came with it, a damp, penetrating chill that seeped through the steel of the Humber and settled deep in MacLeod's bones. The wreckage of the second car still burned fitfully, its flames a guttering, defiant pyre that cast long, dancing shadows across the causeway. The tide was now fully in, and the world beyond their narrow strip of gravel was a vast, dark expanse of water, the waves lapping gently against the stone embankments. They were utterly marooned. Inside the crippled Humber, the darkness was almost absolute, thick with the smell of blood, cordite, and fear. MacLeod had managed to staunch the worst of Evans's bleeding with a field dressing. The boy was in shock, his body racked with shivers that had nothing to do with the cold. He sat huddled in the gunner's seat, staring into the blackness, his breathing shallow and ragged. "We need to get out of the car, son," MacLeod said, his voice quiet but firm. "They'll have mortars ranged on us by now. We're just a sitting duck in here." Evans didn't respond. MacLeod reached out and gripped his shoulder. "Evans, we move or we die. It's that simple. We find what cover we can behind the other wreck." The thought of leaving the relative safety of the armored car was terrifying, but the logic was undeniable. A single well-placed mortar bomb would turn their steel shell into a charnel house. Slowly, Evans nodded. MacLeod took the Sten gun from its rack, its cheap, stamped metal construction feeling flimsy and inadequate. He pushed open the side hatch with a groan of protesting metal. The night air was sharp and briny. "Stay low. Follow me." He slid out of the hatch and dropped to the gravel, the stones crunching under his boots. He crawled on his belly towards the burning wreck 20 yards away, the heat from its flames a welcome relief against the cold. The light made him feel terribly exposed, a silhouette for any German sniper. He expected the crack of a rifle or the chatter of an MG-42 at any second, but the silence held. He reached the shadow of the overturned Humber and pressed himself against its still warm hull. A moment later, Evans crawled up beside him, his movements clumsy with pain and fear. They were not alone. 3 other figures were huddled in the darkness, survivors from the second car. One was Corporal Davies, a tough, wiry NCO. Another was Trooper Allen, the gunner who had a nasty burn down one arm. The third man was dead, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. "Sergeant," Davies whispered, his voice hoarse. "Lieutenant's gone. The whole crew in the lead car just gone." "What are the orders?" MacLeod looked at the faces of the 3 living men, illuminated by the firelight. They were looking to him. He was the senior NCO. He was command. The weight of it settled on him heavier than any pack. "The orders are to survive," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We establish a defensive perimeter right here. Allen, can you still fire a weapon?" The trooper nodded, cradling his burned arm. "Aye, Sergeant." "Good. You and Evans take the far side of the wreck. Use the Bren from your car if it's still working. Davies, you're with me. We'll cover the road back to South Beveland. 2 hours on, 2 hours off. We watch for patrols." It was a pathetic defense. For men, one of them wounded, with a handful of rifles and a light machine gun, holding a 10-yard stretch of a mile-long causeway. But it was something. It was an act of defiance. It was a refusal to simply lie down and die. As the men moved to their positions, MacLeod tried the radio set in Davies's wrecked Humber. It was dead, smashed by the shell impact. No contact with the 15th Reconnaissance Regiment. No way to call for the artillery support that was supposed to be on call for the forces clearing the Scheldt Estuary. No way to tell the 51st Highland Division that their reconnaissance probe had been annihilated. The grand strategy, Operation Vitality, felt like a bitter joke. While generals moved divisions on maps in their warm command posts, they were here, freezing in the mud, their only company the dead and the dying. The first German probe came near midnight. They were quiet, ghosts in the darkness. 3 men moving cautiously along the railway embankment. Davies spotted them first, a flicker of movement against the dark water. "Contact," he breathed. MacLeod raised his Sten gun. He waited until they were 30 yards away, their shapes becoming clearer in the gloom. He gave them a short 3-round burst. The sound was shockingly loud in the stillness. One of the figures grunted and fell. The other 2 immediately dropped to the ground and returned fire, the flashes from their rifles stabbing the darkness. From the other side of the wreck, the Bren gun opened up, its steady, rhythmic hammering a comforting sound. The German patrol, having found the position occupied, scurried back into the night, dragging their wounded comrade with them. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. It meant they were still alive, still fighting. But MacLeod knew it was just the beginning. The Germans on Walcheren Island, likely elements of the 70th Infantry Division, knew they were here. They knew they were cut off. They would not leave them unmolested. They would keep probing, keep harassing them with mortars, wearing them down until they could be finished off with a final assault. As the long night wore on, the cold intensified. The fire in the wrecked Humber died down to a dull, red glow, and then to blackness. The darkness became total, a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to press in on them. Every sound was magnified, the lapping of the water, the rustle of the wind, the chattering of Evans's teeth. MacLeod fought to stay awake, his mind a loop of tactical problems and bitter regrets. He thought of the fresh-faced Lieutenant Shaw and his talk of a milk run. He thought of Crieff, the quiet driver. He thought of the planners who had sent them down this perfect, paved corridor of death. The Battle of the Scheldt would be won, Antwerp would be opened, and the war would be shortened. But the price was being paid here now by forgotten men on the Sloe Channel Causeway. Dawn broke on the 1st of November, a miserable gray light that revealed a landscape of utter desolation. The causeway was littered with the debris of their small battle. Smoking wrecks, spent cartridges, and the dark stains of oil and blood on the gravel. The tide had receded, exposing the vast, empty mudflats again. The world felt silent, empty, and dead. Evans was delirious, his fevered whispers a constant, unsettling murmur in the quiet. Allen's burn had turned an angry, weeping red. Davies's face was a pale, drawn mask of exhaustion. MacLeod felt a weariness so profound it was like a physical illness. They were low on ammunition and had no food or water, save for the half-full canteen he'd taken from a dead man. The German shelling started at 8 o'clock, with methodical, terrifying precision. It wasn't a barrage, but a slow, deliberate torture. A single mortar would fire. They would hear the distant, hollow thump, then the long, agonizing wait as the bomb climbed to its apex and fell towards them. The whistle would grow from a faint whisper to a piercing shriek, and they would brace themselves for the impact. The explosions bracketed their position, sending showers of gravel and metal fragments whining through the air. Each blast was a roll of the dice. They huddled behind the wreckage, making themselves as small as possible, feeling as helpless as insects under a magnifying glass. MacLeod knew they could not stay here. To remain was to be ground into dust by the German mortars. Their only hope, however slim, was to fall back, to try and make it to the South Beveland end of the causeway. It was nearly a mile away, a mile of open, exposed road with no cover. To attempt it in daylight was suicide. They would have to wait for night. The day crawled by, an eternity of hunger, thirst, and fear. The mortar fire was sporadic but constant, a psychological weapon designed to break their will. Every hour that passed, their chances of survival diminished. MacLeod tried to keep the men's spirits up, talking of the relief that must surely be coming from the 51st Highland Division. He spoke of the massive power of the 1st Canadian Army, of how the battle to clear the Scheldt Estuary was the top priority. But the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. He looked at the exhausted, blood-streaked faces of his men and saw the truth in their eyes. They knew. They had been written off. As dusk began to settle once more, MacLeod gathered the 3 conscious men. "We move as soon as it's full dark," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "We take the Bren and what ammo we can carry. We leave everything else. We stay off the road, move along the railway line. It'll be harder going, but it offers more cover. Davies, you take point. Allen, you and I will carry Evans. We don't stop. For anything. Understood?" They nodded, their faces grim. There was no argument, no discussion. It was their only chance. As the last light faded from the sky, they began their desperate trek. Carrying Evans was a nightmare. The boy was a dead weight, moaning and struggling in his delirium. MacLeod's muscles screamed in protest. His lungs burned. They stumbled over the cratered earth and twisted railway tracks, their progress painfully slow. Every shadow seemed to hold a German patrol. Every sound was a threat. They had covered less than half a mile when the flares went up. Brilliant white star shells burst high above them, illuminating the causeway in a stark, merciless glare. They froze, caught in the open like moths pinned to a board. A second later, the MG-42S opened up from Walcheren Island. The tracer rounds zipped through the air, inches above their heads, a terrifying web of green light. They had been spotted. "Down! Get down!" MacLeod yelled, dropping to the ground and pulling Evans with him. They lay in a shallow ditch, the bullets cracking over them, the flares turning the night to day. The Sloe Channel Causeway had become their prison once more, and it seemed there was no escape. This was it, MacLeod thought. The end of the line. The 51st Highland Division would push on, Operation Vitality would succeed, but they would be just another footnote, another small, forgotten sacrifice in the grinding calculus of war. They were alone, and the night and the enemy was closing in. Back at the temporary command post of the 51st Highland Division, Major Black stared at the map table, a grim expression on his face. The grease pencil marks showed the planned advances, the arrows pushing aggressively towards Walcheren. But one small part of the map, a thin line labeled Sloe Channel Causeway, was a source of mounting anxiety. "Still no word from C Troop 15th Recce?" he asked his signals officer, a young captain with tired eyes. "Nothing, sir. We lost contact at 16:25 yesterday, just after they reported starting their advance across the causeway." Black swore under his breath. He had argued against the reconnaissance in force. He had seen the aerial photographs. It was a death trap. But command, eager for progress in the stalled Battle of the Scheldt, had insisted. They needed to know the strength of the German defenses on Walcheren before committing the main infantry battalions, men from units like the Black Watch and the Calgary Highlanders. And C Troop had drawn the short straw. "They've been forgotten," Black muttered to himself. He tapped the map. The entire focus is on the main amphibious landing from the south. This causeway, it's a sideshow, a bloody, necessary sideshow. He knew in his gut that Lieutenant Shaw and his men were either all dead or in a situation so dire it amounted to the same thing. He felt a pang of guilt, the familiar helplessness of a staff officer sending men to their doom. The success of Operation Vitality depended on information, and that information was paid for in blood. Pinned down in the ditch, the world a chaos of light and noise, MacLeod felt a strange sense of clarity. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but his mind was working with a detached, ruthless efficiency. The German machine guns were firing high, sweeping the area rather than targeting them specifically. They were suppressing, not trying to annihilate. Not yet. "We have to go back," he hissed to Davies. "Back to the wrecks. It's our only cover." The thought of retracing their steps, of returning to the prison they had just tried to escape, was soul-crushing. But it was their only option. "On my signal," MacLeod said. "We crawl. Don't run. Crawl. Under the fire." He waited for a lull, a brief pause as one of the MG-42s changed its belt. Now! They moved, their bodies scraping against the cold, wet ground. It was a slow, agonizing journey, each yard a monumental effort. The flares began to die out, plunging the causeway back into a blessed darkness. They reached the dubious sanctuary of the wrecked Humbers, their bodies trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. They had survived, but they were back where they had started, only weaker, more exposed, and with less hope than before. The second night on the causeway was a descent into a private hell. Evans's delirium grew worse. He began to cry out, his voice a thin, reedy sound in the darkness. MacLeod had to clamp a hand over the boy's mouth, his heart aching with a mixture of pity and brutal necessity. A single shout could bring down a storm of mortar fire. Alan, his burned arm now a swollen, useless appendage, had retreated into a shell of silent misery. Only Davies remained, his face a grim mask of stoicism, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness. MacLeod felt his own resolve beginning to fray. The lack of sleep, the constant tension, the gnawing hunger and thirst were wearing him down. He found himself drifting, his mind replaying fragments of his past. He remembered the heat and dust of North Africa, the wild, chaotic battles in the desert. That had been a war of movement, of sweeping advances and desperate retreats. This was different. This was a static, grinding attrition. This was the mud and cold of the Western Front, a war his father had fought and barely survived. He was trapped not just on a causeway, but in a nightmare from another generation. He was a man of the 51st Highland Division, a unit that had been captured and then reformed, a unit that prided itself on its resilience. But even resilience had its limits. Sometime before dawn, a new sound reached them, a low, guttural rumble from the South Beveland end of the causeway. It was the sound of heavy engines. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through MacLeod. A relief column. Tanks. They were saved. He crawled to the edge of the wreckage and peered into the darkness. He could see the shapes now, low-slung, menacing silhouettes moving slowly towards them. But they weren't Shermans. They weren't Churchills. The shapes were unfamiliar, their engine noise a different pitch. And then he saw the long, elegant barrels of their guns, and a cold dread washed over him. They were German. Panzer counterattack. On the Walcheren shore, a German lieutenant named Keller watched the scene through his field glasses. His small Kampfgruppe, a mix of infantry from the 70th Infantry Division and a handful of assault guns, had been tasked with holding the western end of the causeway. He had seen the British reconnaissance probe destroyed the day before. He had ordered the harassing mortar fire. He had spotted their pathetic escape attempt. Now, with the tide out, he was sending his assault guns to finish them off. It was a simple, brutal piece of military arithmetic. "They are trapped, Herr Lieutenant," his sergeant said, a veteran with a weary face. "Why waste the fuel?" "Because, Klaus," Keller replied without lowering his glasses. "We must show them that there is no hope here. We must break their will before their main attack comes. This is not about killing for men. It is about killing an idea." MacLeod's mind raced. They had one Bren gun with 2 magazines left, a handful of rifle rounds, a single grenade. It was nothing against armor. They were going to be crushed, ground into the gravel of the causeway. He looked at the faces of his men. Evans was mercifully unconscious. Allen was staring at the approaching assault guns with a look of blank resignation. Davies was gripping his rifle, his knuckles white, his jaw set. "Davies," MacLeod said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "Give me the Bren. You and Allen, get Evans as far back as you can. Use the ditch. Go now." "And you, Sergeant?" Davies asked, his voice thick. "I'm going to buy you some time." It was a suicide mission, and they both knew it. But there was no other choice. It was the unwritten code of the NCO. You looked after your men. You were the last to retreat. Davies hesitated for a second, then nodded. He helped MacLeod set up the Bren gun in a small crater, its barrel pointing down the long, straight road. They exchanged a look, a final, unspoken acknowledgement. Then Davies and Allen were gone, dragging the unconscious form of Evans into the darkness. MacLeod was alone. He chambered around in the Bren, the sound a solid, reassuring click. He watched the lead assault gun grow larger in his sights. He could hear the clatter of its tracks, the rumble of its engine. He thought of his home in the Scottish Highlands, of the quiet hills and the clean, cold air. He thought of the promise he had made to himself to survive, to go home. It seemed a lifetime ago. He let the assault gun come on, let it get to within 100 yards. He took a deep breath, the briny air filling his lungs. He was a sergeant in the 15th Reconnaissance Regiment, 51st Highland Division. He was not a forgotten man. He was a soldier, and this was his post. He wrapped his finger around the trigger and began to fire. The Bren gun bucked in his hands, its tracers reaching out into the darkness, sparking uselessly against the thick steel of the assault gun. He held the trigger down, emptying the magazine in one long, defiant burst. The German vehicle paused, its own machine gun chattering, the bullets kicking up dust and stone all around him. He slammed in the last magazine, his movements sure and steady. He fired again, not at the assault gun, but over it, into the darkness beyond, a final, futile signal to a world that could not hear him. And then, from the South Beveland end of the causeway, a new sound. The unmistakable, high-pitched shriek of incoming artillery shells. But these were not German mortars. This was the sound of British 25-pounders. A barrage, a rolling, thunderous storm of high explosives, walked its way up the causeway, the shells bursting in a line of brilliant, terrifying flashes. The German assault guns, caught in the open, were thrown into confusion. One of them took a direct hit and exploded in a ball of fire. The others, their nerve broken, began to reverse, scurrying back towards the safety of Walcheren Island. MacLeod stared, dumbfounded, as the friendly artillery barrage swept past him and onto the German positions. He was alive. He was still alive. A few minutes later, he heard voices, the clipped, unmistakable sound of Canadian accents. Figures began to emerge from the gloom, men in the uniforms of the Black Watch, their bayonets fixed, their faces grim and determined. They were the lead elements of the main assault. A young officer knelt beside him.
Christ, Mann.
Who are you? What are you doing here? MacLeod looked up, his face a mask of grime and exhaustion. Sergeant MacLeod, 15th Recce, he rasped. We were delayed. The battle for the Sloe Channel Causeway had begun. The 48 hours were over. MacLeod was no longer forgotten. He was the last man of C Troop, a ghost who had held the line, a silent witness to the price of a single straight road. The grand strategy of Operation Vitality would now be paid for in full, yard by bloody yard, across the mud and stone he had refused to surrender.